Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Wherever you are, welcome to the Bloomberg Center for Cities at Harvard University. It is my pleasure to facilitate this conversation with three thought leaders, globally recognized experts about next level urban problem solving, institutional innovation in cities. The problems facing cities today are not only urgent, but they're interconnected. And the institutions that are supposed to solve these problems were designed for a different era or for different types of challenges. So we're going to explore in today's conversation what it will take to get cities to operate at a next level of problem solving. And today with us we have Professor Beth Simone Novak from Northeastern University. She is the director of the Burns Center for Social Change, as well as the Governance Lab at Northeastern. She is also very active in practice and is currently the Chief Innovation Officer of the state of New Jersey and very active on issues like how to harness artificial intelligence in government. She is also an author of the very important book, Solving Public Problems, and we're going to talk a lot about her thinking that she expressed in that book. We also have Bruce Katz, who is the author of The Metropolitan Revolution and the New Localism. He is a global expert on city governance and is an advisor to many local leaders as well as economic development initiatives. He is the inaugural director of the City Governance Project at the Brookings Institution, and he also co-led the housing transition team for President Obama, and he is currently a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. And finally, we have with us Sir Geoff Mulgan, who is a professor of collective intelligence, public policy, and social innovation at University College London. He previously led Nesta in the UK and the Young Foundation, and was also a senior official in the national government, including the Prime Minister's Office, and director of the strategy unit in that country. He also co-founded Demos and the Institutional Architecture Lab. And the research that the Institutional Architecture Lab has produced on institutional innovation is what he'll be presenting for the first 10 minutes of this conversation. So I'm very excited to turn over to my friend and colleague, Professor Geoff Mulgan.
Well, thank you very much, Jorrit, and it's great to be with Beth and Bruce as well. I've learned a huge amount from all three of you over the years, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. In a way, what I'm going to talk about is the role of institutions in problem solving. Not every city problem can be solved by a new institution, but throughout history, cities have created new institutions for education, for public health, for sewage, for policing, and many people feel there is a mismatch between the tasks of the next few years and some of the inherited institutions. So I'll give you a sort of flavour of some thinking about this. I think what's not in doubt is that cities are playing an increasingly important role all over the world. This is from The Guardian yesterday. Perhaps as national governments are going a bit crazy sometimes, mayors are filling the space, highly active on everything from housing to climate change to poverty. But the question is whether their tools are right. If you look around the world, the physical shape of city halls isn't that different often from 50, 100 years ago. And their organograms are often not that different. This is New York's organogram of a year ago. Now, there's nothing wrong with old buildings or old structures, but we need to periodically ask if they are actually fit for purpose, whether they are aligned with the tasks cities need to do. And what I want to briefly focus on is some of the new ideas which might help cities succeed on the big issues like climate, housing, affordability, and how actually cities make the most of their resources. Their money, their intelligence, the civic energy. How do you harness that? For me, that's the central governance design question of the next few years. And one of the reasons why I think it's live for us is that we're in an era of incredible organizational innovation. All around us are these innovations in business, platform-based, search-based, AI-based organizations, also in civil society, collective intelligence-based things like Wikipedia, and totally new organizational models like Buurtzorg in social care. And in 2024, the Nobel Prize for Economics went to Darren Acemoglu for his work showing that institutional design may be the single best explanation of why some societies grow and others don't. And if he's right, and I think he was, then the same applies today. How we design our institutions now will hugely shape how cities and nations fare over the next few decades. There is quite a lot of institutional innovation happening in the public sector around the world. These are a few examples. They range from the UID in India, which helped hundreds of millions out of poverty, new ways of handling skills in Singapore, future generations commissioners, the X-Road in Estonia, new innovation teams in governments, the huge guidance funds in China, new global bodies like the ones on biodiversity. The UAE even has a Ministry of Possibilities. And there's things like the Cyberspace Administration and the many attempts to regulate AI. So quite a lot is happening, but it's not very well documented, understood, and perhaps not being used to its full. And so what I want to suggest here is a way of thinking about city governance as a mesh. And in a way, that idea comes partly from the internet, which is very much designed as a mesh. And in fact, the World Wide Web was originally going to be called the mesh by Tim Berners-Lee. But I think this provides a way of thinking about how perhaps cities could be reimagining their structures in the years ahead. And I'll do 1 minute each on a few examples of that. So a first one is how you move to much easier frictionless services. And all cities are struggling with this. Mexico City has the Jave a model of digital service identification, which has now been adopted by the national government under President Sheinbaum. Hong Kong has a fantastic example too. And these are all ways where cities are creating standardized, simplified digital platform tools to make it much easier to access hundreds of different services. Incredible change in the last few years in making everyday life more frictionless. A very different example is how do you orchestrate intelligence of the city to make the most of the brain power of the people or of universities. Many, many new innovations around this. One of my favourites is Amsterdam, which has open research, which links the city and universities and civil society into hundreds of working groups to do problem solving together in teams with editors sharing the results. It's a kind of obvious model, but very few cities have anything like that. And then there are many examples around social policy, social care, from Bogota's care blocks to the utopias of Mexico City to the many cities around the world like Seoul, which are creating new integrated services for the elderly as populations age. So the senior hubs are just one example of bringing together health, care and housing in an integrated way with aligned mandates and budgets, and many, many other examples of this, which will become increasingly important as demographic change continues. A lot of what we're looking at is about speed of response. There are many more crises of all kinds. Some cities have created chief heat officers to deal with the pressures of heat. There are resilience officers. There are examples like Rio, which 15 years ago created an extraordinary control room for crises. And everywhere's trying to think about how do you combine different services. This is just an example from Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, which has a model trying to link the national government, the city government, different kind of commands, and integrate multiple types of data so as to respond really quickly when there is an emergency. And a final example is about affordability. How do you make services cheaper for your citizens, and how do you also back your small businesses, the self-employed, which are such a large part of modern city economies and everything from cab driving to software, design to retail. And here are some of the most interesting examples drawn platform thinking, and India's in the lead very much here, to create open network models so you have a platform above the Ubers and Airbnbs, which helps you, the citizen, get the best possible deal and not be locked into a vertical digital stack. And this opens up a way, again, of making services cheaper for citizens, but also empowering your small providers so they're not completely captured by the big oligopoly companies. So those are just a few examples of innovations in organizational forms. And we're seeing a kind of new language of tools for pulling this together. The traditional city, like most governments, was very much organized in silos, departments, agencies, very much protecting their turf. But as I think we all know, most issues cut across those silos. And so there's a new sort of language of tools of how you create shared budgets or targets or appointments or data or teams, modular elements in your digital services, and then also ways to quickly identify when there's contradictions and pressures and political problems. And then around the city, not only teams which cut across the silos, flash teams for problem solving, innovation teams of the kind Bloomberg supports, but also then around them partnerships around intelligence, around urban regeneration, and around the mobilization of capital, for example, for transitions to zero carbon. This is, in a sense, a new kind of grammar of how to organize things horizontally as well as vertically. It doesn't work for everything. Some tasks are still best solved in quite traditional ways and don't need institutional innovation. But more and more, I think we are going to see these ways of thinking become more common to liberate us from the traditional organograms, which you'll all be familiar with, and think instead in terms of stacks, of meshes, of platforms, of protocols, even more organic biological ways of thinking like myceliums or swarms or octopuses and corals. And my hope is in the next few years we'll see these become just obvious, just part of the common sense of city governance. And I guess what I hope we can get out of this session is some conversation about where might these be relevant, where do we need them, where don't we need them, and what might be the toolkit of 10, 15 years' time. And a very final point, all of these, I think, are underpinned by almost a new ethos and almost an aesthetic of city governance, which I like to call strength without weight. This is becoming very common in architecture. You build buildings with far less mass in their columns and their structures. This is a cathedral made out of cardboard. And it's a way of thinking about bureaucracy where you get the maximum impact, but without too much process and bureaucracy and paperwork and law. And it's also a principle we're seeing in advanced materials like graphene, which is the incredibly powerful, strong, carbon-based material now showing up in many products, but is a really good example of strength without weight. So I'd like to see the public sector learn from architecture, learn from materials as it rethinks how to create much more dynamic, much more agile structures. And this may be part of the common sense of mayors and city halls in 2035. Apologies for a chat GPT generated image, slightly comic. I don't think there'll be that many sort of things in the sky in 2035. But I think it's worth imagining what will be the city hall of the fairly near-term future in an age when many people born this year probably will live to 90 or 100 or 110. This isn't really very far away. We should be capable of imagining something different. Thank you.
Very thought-provoking. My first question is for Bruce. If frictionless service and orchestrated intelligence and fluidity and speed and new horizontal models of governance are part of the solution or required for solutions, what are the problems that are calling for these new forms of institutional innovation? Can you say a little bit about what you see today? You've been a scholar of urban challenges for a long time and have documented many of these challenges and have heralded city leaders as global problem solvers, frontline problem solvers. So what do you see today that requires this new thinking and new action with regards to city governance?
Well, first of all, kudos to Jeff. Really great scene setter. Cities and metropolitan areas are the engines of national economies, and they're the vehicles for problem solving. Today, and this is particularly true in the United States, but I think it really covers a large portion of the globe, they are navigating very complex political disorder, as well as economic restructuring. On the political side, if you take the U.S. as an example, at one level, Trump has centralized power in the White House, literally, on an hour-by-hour basis. But the outcome of that is to decentralize responsibility. Someone at the end of the day has to be an adult in the country and actually solve problems, and I'll talk about that. But the second thing that cities and metropolitan areas are navigating is geopolitical tension, remilitarization, reshoring, all happening at a time of accelerating technologies and transnational threats like climate, like migration. At the end of the day, cities are both governments, but what makes them different than national governments or provincial or state governments is their networks. Business, philanthropy, university, labor, nonprofit. And when cities function, and we're particularly seeing this in the U.S., it's because they're seeing that broader collaboration come together in pursuit of shared goals. In the U.S., I would say, but also for a good portion of the world, that means understanding your literal position in a shifting global economy. What sets you apart? What's your raison d'etre? Particularly around industry, particularly around innovation, particularly around technology. And then how do you become better at what you're doing? How do you realize the best version of yourself? But second, how do you deal with the externalities? How do you deal with affordability? Whether it's in housing, whether it's with goods and services. So all this has been pushed down, and irrespective of what national leaders say. And whether we're in a period of national largesse, which we were in the U.S. under Biden, or whether it's just chaos, where we are today, at the ground level, you need to navigate, you need to assert what is our position, what are our goals and outcomes, and what's our way of getting there. And what we have, and then I'll stop, is a natural circuitry of innovation. However cities organize themselves locally at the metropolitan scale, when one city stands up and says, I've got a new way of dealing with housing, I have a new way to leverage my industry and technology, guaranteed those first movers become fast followers relatively quickly. And then we begin to see sort of cycles of innovation occur and spread and scale.
Yeah. So in a way, what you said before is that economic growth, or the responsibility for economic growth and affordability have been pushed down, but the power hasn't necessarily followed. I mean, there have been revenue streams in the U.S. And in other countries, but what exactly remains unsolved at the local level that requires this specific mode of governance that Jeff has presented? Like, what doesn't work anymore that maybe used to work one day, but doesn't suffice given the current challenges?
So here's the question. I mean, it really gets to what Jeff had. I mean, if you look under Biden, semiconductor investments, clean energy investments, under Trump and this continuing Biden in the U.S., major investments in defense, particularly industrial, particularly around defense tech. These come down in silos, right? Whether it's a competitive program, whether it's procurement, they come in silos. If you're at the city and metropolitan level and you have to deal with a surge in manufacturing, you then have to basically grapple with, do we have the right set of workers? Do we have the right skills? Are we working with our universities and community colleges? Do we have suppliers that are close to the major manufacturing companies? Do we have R&D coming out of our universities that are aligned with our industry? Do we have logistics? Do we have energy? So the national governments tend to deal in silos, so do states. Send money down these chutes and stovepipes. But only the city and metropolitan level, whether it's business, whether it's city hall, whether it's philanthropy, whether it's a combination, can look across all these dimensions and bring some order out of chaos and realize the full potential of their position.
Right. And this is true across different policy areas? I mean,
oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
If you take housing, we're not going to solve the housing challenge just by reforming zoning and land use. Absolutely critical. We need new capital stacks. We need to unlock public assets, land and buildings. We need innovation in modular construction. We need innovation in governance. Only cities and metropolitan areas can actually look across that large spread of issues and challenges and then respond in kind.
Well, thanks so much for that. I'd like to ask you, Beth, your book, Solving Public Problems, really like it, mostly because you really put your finger on something that is often overlooked, which is the importance of diagnosis before solving problems. We all want to solve problems, but what is the problem that needs solving, right? And so when you hear Bruce about all of these problems that require a more integrated, more holistic approach almost, what do you see in terms of urban problems that are poorly diagnosed or insufficiently addressed that require this new mode of governance? Can you say a little bit more about what's the problem with the problem before we can, explore what solutions might look like?
I'd be happy to. We have a joke in my house that for every time I say the word defining the problem, I have to pay a nickel because I say it so often. And I really want to commend to everybody to read Jeff and Kaio's paper. It is really, first of all, a fantastic read. It's just a fun and super read and so full of wonderful examples.
On that note, we'll drop a link in the chat so that everybody has access to the working.
And I don't get a nickel for that, but to Bruce's point, this idea of being inspired by examples of how we solve problems, the agility with which one city wants to copy what another city does is fantastic. But to get to the question you're asking me, we have to understand first what the problem is. And that's why particularly the urban level, where we are closer to understanding the on-the-ground conditions that impede implementation of the solution. It's easy for policymakers wherever, at whatever level in their silo of vertical expertise to talk about sort of issuing a policy, but the implementation and execution that Bruce is talking about is what's so crucial. And so really understanding what the problems are that impede that implementation is what's so crucial. So I got a call yesterday from a government agency that shall remain nameless, asking about improving performance on a particular delivery of a particular government benefit. And of course, they were calling me because they want to know, build us some AI. There must be a chat bot we can use to improve how we deliver this service. And of course, that's the classic. And now there's a lot of rush to say that, there's a chat bot for this or a chat bot for that or some tech solution. Or it used to be a few years ago, there was a data solution to everything. And a few years before that, there was a human-centered design solution for everything. We had a tool in the toolkit. But the question is the issue with your benefit, the fact that people aren't aware of the benefit. That they're aware of the benefit, but there's no uptake of the benefit. Maybe there's uptake of the benefit, but the form that you're giving them is so complicated and time-consuming that they're abandoning it before they finish it. Or maybe they're filling it out, but there's something happening on the back end with the way that it's being processed. So this is a very, at some level, mundane example, but I think it comes down to often these rather mundane details of execution that require us to ask the question, what is the root cause of the problem? It's something, by the way, that here at Harvard, the Harvard Capability Lab has been very pioneering in sort of developing this methodology. Is asking, not just as Amsterdam has done, how do we get together those cross-cutting teams to come up with solutions to problems? How do we get together industry, academia, and government to ask about, again, how do we solve the problem? But to think about how we take some of Jeff's examples of cross-cutting, silo-busting ways of working to ask why is the problem occurring in the first place is a really important, I think, step, and then asking what can each of us do to help solve that problem. And yes, maybe part of it is about awareness building, which industry and civil society can help with by getting out the word better about that benefit that may exist. And maybe there is a tech solution to rebuilding the form, and maybe there's an organizational solution to rebuilding the back-end administration of how that service is delivered, or whatever the topic is that we're talking about. But I'm glad you asked, because I think it's worth pausing on the fact, and I think there's so much just very concretely that anyone listening in government can do to ask, how can we work differently to spend more time thinking about what the reason is the problem is happening? Einstein's, famous quote, that's 95% of it, and then, the 5%, the 5 minutes that's left, is where we really have the solutions that Bruce's networked approach really speaks to, that we can just do faster because he already has all the solutions for us. Brookings has developed them all. Bloomberg has developed them all. So we know what to do. The question is which tool we need in the toolkit to apply to the problem.
Thank you for that. I want to talk a little bit more about this. You've studied public problem solving and have engaged in problem solving at all levels of governance. And you make this distinction between the policy solution and capacity to deliver, to execute, to implement. And a lot of what you say is about a lack of capacity to do that well. And so a lot of the problems that remain very pressing in cities are not because there's a lack of policy ideas, but there's a lack of capacity to diagnose the problem, to adapt a solution to a local context, and to then implement and improve and iterate and so forth. Can you say a little bit more, like, why is that lacking? What is missing? Is it a human resource problem? Is it a mental model that's outdated? What explains the fact that this is such a challenge still today?
So I think there's, back to the why is the problem occurring, I think there's a number of root causes to this one, but let me home in on one of them, which is the lack of training and upskilling, the lack of investment in people that we make. So as we talk about these new ways of working, new ways of organizing, we have to at the same time develop the mindsets and the skill sets to work in new ways. As we talk about using new tools or new methods, whether it's human-centered design, whether it's new forms of collective intelligence building, whether it's using AI, we have to teach people how to use these skills. That's something we do regularly in the private sector. IBM says at one point everybody in the firm needs to learn human-centered design. Or the government in Singapore came along, you probably had something to do with this, and said everybody needs to learn how to code at some point. And so I think, though, in the U.S. in particular, we do not make these same investments in upskilling. And now I think that problem, on the one hand, it's gotten worse with the firings we've seen in the public sector. On the other hand, and we'll probably get more to this, AI has opened up new opportunity here. It's opened up people's minds to going, oh, we have some new skills we need to teach people and we need to learn. So it's created an appetite for learning that I haven't seen before, not just for AI, but for other things. But it's really brought to the fore the question of why we haven't invested in workers. And we're asking this question now, both for private sector and for public sector. What are the skills people need in the 21st century? Jeff has done a lot of work in this space over the years. And I think it's a big issue in the capacity building front. If we want to implement and we want to work in new ways, we have to teach people how to do it.
Thank you. So, Jeff, what Bruce said about national governments, in particular the federal government in the United States, being siloed in the way it invests in cities and leaving the integration and the more holistic approach of problem solving to cities. What Beth says is like, well, at many levels there is a lack of capacity to actually do this work well. You have looked at this internationally and at many different levels of government. What is your analysis or assessment of where the problem stems from? In your presentation, you said like these structures are outdated. Today's problems require a different approach, but today's technologies also provide opportunities to do so, to work in this mesh-like way. But say a little bit more about why do we still need to do so much work on our problem-solving infrastructure and capacity?
Yeah, well, I agree with absolutely everything that's been said so far, so I won't repeat that. I think it's important to say silos are quite good for some things. I don't believe in getting rid of all silos. For certain kind of tasks, they're a very efficient way of concentrating power, expertise, capability, and accountability. The problem is they just don't fit some of the key tasks. And then I think the key, as both Beth and Bruce have said, is having a repertoire of methods, because the problem of growth, let's say an inward investor comes in with a major investment in defence or data centres, you as the city have to pull together, curate, exactly as you said, quite different capacities of skills, of R&D, maybe of energy. And that's very different from, let's say, an issue like mental health, large-scale mental health. Many cities are worried about that. They don't have a capability for how to handle the problems of anxiety and depression. and that needs probably new institutions, new capabilities to be built up. There's then a very different set of issues of the kind Beth mentioned on jobs transitions. All over the world, people are going to need new skills to cope with a world where AI is both destroying jobs and changing jobs. And very few cities yet have a very well structured capability to help people navigate all of those profound uncertainties. And so the key, I think, if you're a city, is having a repertoire for diagnosing those different problems, understanding how different they are in nature. And some of them require much more partnership, mesh working. But then others might be, if, let's say you want to make bus services cheaper, as a certain mayor wants to do. You don't need a new institution for that. That's a very easy thing to do with existing structures. So don't waste time trying to overthink it or over-innovate. I think we are in a time too where there's some subtle, almost psychological, cultural challenges of city governance, of misinformation, distrust, polarization, which again I think cities will need not only new skills and capabilities, but possibly new institutions to help them resolve that. I've been a bureaucrat most of my life. My first job was in city government as a bureaucrat. And maybe this is a controversial thing to say, but bureaucracy's natural tendency is inertia, is not to change, is to do things the way they've always done them. So to innovate adequately for a changing environment always requires some pressure, some leadership, some discomfort. And that in a way is the heart of the answer to your question, why we don't yet have enough capabilities for today's problems. It's not really surprising.
Our colleague Mitch Weiss at the Harvard Business School always says, you know what would happen without silos? There would be corn everywhere. So, in a way, like that's the point you're making, right? Like structures are good for certain purposes, and then they're insufficient and inadequate for others. And so, I'd like to take one example that you just offered and go to Beth and ask your reaction. You said, well, if you want to make the buses free, that can be done in a more traditional way. We don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about doing that differently. I think you had a slightly different take on this, coming with your AI head on, thinking about how to harness technology. Would you agree with Jeff?
It's funny. Right after the incoming administration now in New York City, about which I think there's a lot of excitement, myself included. The promise of what's possible there, the idea of visionary leadership is really exciting. But Executive Order number 2 coming out of New York City announces the hiring of a fabulous and exciting group of new people, but in a very traditional, looks a lot like that organogram that you showed us earlier, some names swapped out, some new titles on it for issues that are kind of front and center in terms of priority. But no innovation in terms of, again, we'll let them get to Executive Order 3 and 4. There's still time. It's, we're in week 1. So I'm hopeful, but I really want them to read your paper. Because exactly for that reason, I think that we're leaving the organogram relatively intact. When I think there's an opportunity really to rethink how we go about developing a new problem-solving capability to understand what's happening with the buses, what will happen if we make them free, what will be then the mental health challenges if we make the bus free, and the potentially violence challenges that happen that people are worried about on this particular issue. But I think in short, I want the Mamdani administration to read this new paper.
Well, that's great, because we drop a link. It literally dropped today, I think. So we'll drop the link in the chat box as well so people can review it and share comments with Jeff and his co-author, Kaya Wernick. You do this work in practice in New Jersey at the state level. So what are you doing there that's different from what you just described in the Mamdani administration? You're the chief AI strategist for the state, which is a very cool new role. But you've also been involved in creating the Innovation Authority there. Say a little bit more about how those interventions or new institutional forms change the way the state approaches problems.
Yeah, so
and I note that it's just started.
Yeah, so very briefly, when I came in at the start of the Phil Murphy administration, which is now, next week will be 8 years ago, this is now the conclusion of that administration. We faced a lot of these same challenges about static bureaucracies that didn't have innovative ways of working, of hiring, of buying, of doing things in an agile way. So we created a new thing called the Office of Innovation, which I stood up, and we did a bureaucratic hack. I became a member of the governor's cabinet, but we set up the Office of Innovation as a nonprofit, largely because we didn't have a quick way to create a new entity, and that allowed us to do a lot of innovative things very quickly. And then in turn, we're now shifting that into creating a new innovation authority, which got announced this week. And the incoming governor, Mikey Sherrill, has announced that my successor, Dave Cole, who is part of our innovation team, will lead that effort as the innovation authority. Again, changing the structure in order to institutionalize something in order that it survives politically across administrations while still having these more innovative and flexible ways of working. And then in turn, we created this new thing called the Chief AI Strategy title, in order that we could then create AI leads in every agency. So in short, sort of to Jeff's point, not having one way of doing things, but having that repertoire, having that grammar of new ways of working and pulling different tools out of the toolbox. But now AI is really, I think, game-changing in terms of our ability to do things in a new and different way without new titles, without new structures, without new organizations, that I think shifts the whole conversation.
Yeah. So I want to go back to Bruce and building on the ideas that you've all shared of working more horizontally, adopting a repertoire of strategies and tactics, and thinking more holistically about what the problem is and where solutions might come from. Horizontal seems to be the recurring theme here. A lot of the research that we've been doing at the Bloomberg Center for Cities has been about task forces and multi-departmental teams and cross-sectoral networks focusing on urban problems. And the paradox seems to be that in order for a horizontal form of governance to work, you need very strong executive support to keep it together, to set a direction, to remove obstacles, to, almost sometimes force people to align on something, right? And to get started and to keep going. So can you give an example from your practice and your scholarship around the world in cities of a successful example of a city that adopted that way of working and was able to make progress on a problem?
Yeah, I take Atlanta. Mayor Dickens comes in, basically says, I've got a goal of 20,000 affordable housing units. Some of that will be through production, some of that will be through acquisition, some of that will be through preservation. Looks at his silos and others who are involved in housing and says, we're not going to get there until we pull everyone together that has a stake in this, whether they have housing in their name, or like the school district that owns a lot of land, or other departments that owned a lot of buildings. They all need to be around a table. He sets the goal. He basically centralizes some power in the mayor's office, brings in a new team, and then they begin to meet week by week, not to talk about housing policy in general, but to talk about delivering projects. So you go from the abstract to the specific pretty damn fast. And when everyone's sitting around the table and saying, okay, we've got projects on Avenue X, so to speak, which will produce X number of units, what's holding it up? Is there a capital gap? If there's a capital gap, he also then went to the corporate sector and the philanthropic sector, put in some bond revenues, raised about $300 million, used a portion of that to set up a public asset corporation, modeled on Copenhagen, modeled on Hamburg. So again, the circuitry of innovation. But I think what has really been impressive about Atlanta is centralizing that power and authority, because the threat generally for a lot of people in the system is the mayor's going to pick up the phone and start screaming at you, essentially, which is always a good tactic. I would just say in the private sector, it's not because no one's in charge, everyone's in charge. Once you talk about major companies, business associations, universities, and all the rest, it's a form of radical collaboration. And that's where you have more like strike teams come together with, again, around singular goals. So again, it's not abstract. It may not be 20,000 housing units, but it's basically a Columbus or a Phoenix or a Hampton Roads or a Pittsburgh saying, we declare that we are going to be a global leader around X, semiconductors, AI, robotics. What is it going to take to get there? And that's, the 2 + 2 = 5 effect of radical collaboration. So public sector, there does need to be that centralized, let's get this done, everyone around the table. And then in the network economy, more decentralized, but still with that, mission and focus that's quite clear.
Right. So it is a combination of
Absolutely.
a really focused exercise of authority or power, combined with a much more inclusive and comprehensive set of actors working together and figuring out how that works in a local context.
But Beth raised something which I think is so fundamental here, is we call these people network connectors, people who are able to move horizontally. And that is a certain kind of skill set.
Yeah.
And everyone's sort of learning it by doing to some extent. But we have trained a lot of specialists over many generations and decades. And now we need to basically train and we see these emerging all over the place.
Yeah.
They're able to cut across not just agencies, but sectors, disciplines, jurisdictions. That's a certain kind of skill set.
Yeah. So let me build on that and go back to Jeff. Jeff, you have co-founded this institutional architecture lab, TL, and it's an observatory or think tank about these new forms of governance and institutional innovation. And you've also published about the skills that 21st century public professionals need, including political executives. So when you think about those examples that you think are paradigm cases, that are almost emblematic of the transition that you've described, what did people do to make that happen? What explains the emergence of some of these inspiring examples? Was it a few strong imaginative leaders, or was it a much more distributed effort to make it happen? Were there certain contextual factors that led to it? Is there any pattern that you see in those examples that we might learn from?
So I don't want to overgeneralize, because I think everything is different in different contexts. Most institutional innovation at the moment, I think, is happening not in North America or Europe, I should say more in Asia. And that's probably because of the speed of change, the growth of cities and so on. If you look at most of the examples we're drawing from, they are from Taiwan or India or Singapore, parts of Latin America and Africa. And that's a big change, which I think is explained by perhaps pressures and perhaps the relative stagnation or complacency of some of the systems in perhaps the older OECD democracies. But I'm going to give two examples, which are almost opposite examples, which I think bring to the fore this balance of mobilization and management, which both of you have talked about. How do you both have the network connectors, but also often strength of leadership, the use of authority and power, which you do sometimes need to get stuff to move. So one is about neighborhoods. So in Europe, you talk to mayors what they're most concerned about. Many want to reshape mesh-type governance at the very local level. There's the 15-minute city idea from Mayor Hidalgo in Paris, and variants of this everywhere. And most of them don't have the institutional structures for doing that. And yet at the neighborhood level, everything does have to connect. The library, the primary school, the park, the public space, the safety. And yet every neighborhood is different. So you can't overgeneralize. So there's a very live problem there. How do you get the right kind of structures and capabilities? For some neighborhoods will have very strong identity and social capital, others very weak. Then an opposite example, which is very live, builds on what Beth was saying. So in terms of buses, if you want to make buses cheaper as a mayor, that's very easy to do. And yet, if you're thinking about transport in the next 10 or 15 years, it's a completely different question where all the things Beth has mentioned come into play, because you want to be gathering data on buses and trams and cars and bicycles and pedestrians and micromobility. You'll have to manage a transition to many more driverless cars. You'll need completely different ways of orchestrating using AI to help you. China has one version of that with the city brains in places like Hangzhou. But every city is going to have to rethink, not, as it were, in a traditional siloed way, here's my bus policy, which is just about cutting the prices, but how do I help the whole city to move? And maybe, as some cities like Copenhagen has done, moving people more and more out of cars and even out of public transport into walking and cycling. London's transport policy, London saw cycling overtake car journeys last year for the first time ever. No one expected that 10 or 20 years ago, but it requires a much more holistic, horizontal way of thinking than just focusing on the price of bus fares.
Well, thank you for that. This is the point in the conversation where we invite people who are tuning in online to ask questions. I've already received a few questions here. There are about 500 people online. There's a chat box, a Q&A button, and if you have a question for any of the panelists or for all of them, please submit that. We won't be able to get to all of them, but let me start here. One anonymous attendee asks, how do you shift the focus from solving the problem to first understanding the problem? So this builds on your point, Beth, but it's a question for all of you. Too often, this person writes, there's immense pressure to get to the solution. And sometimes I would add, there's even pressure for a specific solution, whether that matches the problem or not. So in this, context where there is political and public pressure, to solve or to embrace a certain solution, what do you do to kind of take that step back and first see what the problem is and what the nature of the problem is? May I start with you, Bruce, and then go to Beth and then to Jeff?
Well, the political challenges are very real. I mean, people are elected in 2 or 4 year cycles. So when you have a crisis, say housing affordability, sending a signal, we're now going to research the challenge for the 45th time is not going to go over very well. I do think it is essential, particularly given how local the housing challenge is. I mean, in the U.S., everyone talks about build, build, build. Frankly, about a third of our metropolitan markets have been building for a period of time. They tend to be in the Sun Belt. They tend to be in the Mountain West. They don't have the affordability issues that many other places have. So it is critical to do the diagnosis, but it's almost like you need to move on 2 fronts. Let's do that for the longer haul. We can do it in 3 months. We can do it in 6 months. I mean, we've got enough data to basically customize solutions. But while we're doing that, we're going to move on X, Y, and Z, because we've already seen from cities A, B, and C that it works. We don't need to wait for everything. So my recommendation would do simultaneous diagnostic, start delivery. Because once you start delivery, you begin to get the political feedback. Oh, this is a different kind of public sector. This is a public sector that doesn't just talk about it or deliberate. They're actually doing stuff. Yeah. So you've got to move on both fronts if ultimately the public is going to go along with you.
So it's not either or, it's both ends.
Absolutely.
Do something now so you can be seen.
Early wins, sending signals, not just to the citizenry, but to investors. Right. Because investors have been, whether they're lenders, whether they're other investors, they've been, cities have a lot of, whatever Ezra Klein calls it, everything bagel liberalism, which prohibit really fast action. We've got to streamline, we've got to deregulate, we've got to open up to more housing production and more housing acquisition. So you've got to work on both fronts.
Okay. Beth, your take?
One of the things that agile problem solving teaches us is that one of the ways we understand the problem is by trying something.
Absolutely.
Is the best way to understand what is and what isn't working, and that's where agile methodologies have developed to say, look, there's some things we want to do in like little 2-week increments so that we can show progress. Obviously, there are some issues that don't lend themselves to a 2-week solution, but trying to work on both fronts where we're doing that long-term futurism on what is our broad transit strategy and what does that look like over 50 years while we go, what are we doing right here, right now? So I think it's about learning those capabilities for acting quickly, both to diagnose and solve at the same time. But that also requires leadership. That requires having a leader. And if you lead, whether you're the head of something or just the head of a small team or of 2 people or of yourself, that ability to say, I'm going to demand of my team, that 1-page memo about what the problem is and its root causes at the same time as I'm asking for the solutions. So I think that there is a leadership and capacity building piece to this, and it's about training oneself and one's team in how to do some of those things.
And then training not just for civil servants, but also for the politicians?
For politicians and for broader stakeholders. We've been doing a lot of work in cities around the world on getting people inside government and outside, including citizenry, involved in doing that diagnostic work collaboratively so that you have a shared understanding of what the problem is. And by the way, now with AI and AI agents, we can dramatically speed up that process. So we just ran our AI task force in New Jersey using a set of AI agents that allowed us to do research at such rapid speed that it freed up more time for citizen engagement and consultation. And we ran the whole process, in 6 months from start to finish, at really next to no cost by using technology to help us with that diagnostic process.
So interesting, because very often when you hear we first have to diagnose the problem, it sounds like, there's going to be a committee, it's going to take time, it's almost procrastination, right? But what you're saying is it doesn't have to take that much time because new technologies allow us to include people in the problem diagnosis and also do the research more quickly.
I think version 2 of the book will be solving public problems quickly.
Yeah, I like that. Jeff, you have been in government, so you know those political pressures. What do you see today as the main challenge to make sure that diagnosis is possible?
You fix the right problem. So I totally agree. I think we're in a very impatient era. So you've got to be seen to act. You can't have a year-long commission or task force reviewing the evidence. And then we're very lucky to have all these tools. AI can quickly give you evidence syntheses, scan for innovations, contextualize it, all these different things which used to take a long time can be done very, very quickly. And just to give one example of a topic which exemplifies this is homelessness. So in many cities, at first, they think they've got a homelessness problem. It's a problem of shortage of hostel places or housing. And in some places it is. But I've worked in many places on homelessness. And normally when you actually do the diagnosis, you find it's many other things involved about drugs and mental health and alcohol or discharge from prisons or from the army. And if you don't solve that, there's no point just building new accommodation. You're not solving the real problem. And likewise, it's not enough just to get someone into a home. You need to help them with a job or fixing their problems. But all of those things can be tackled in a very rapid learning by doing way, which builds up the confidence, the competence, the capability, not through analysis and paralysis of analysis, but through action. And this is where I think exactly what's being said here about trying to do things in parallel rather than in sequence is the 21st century approach for most things in government, and very different from what used to be probably taught here in the Kennedy School, 20, 30 years ago, where you would have a very long diagnostic phase before you then pass a law, blah, 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 and maybe 3 years, 5 years later you do an evaluation. That doesn't work in the 2020s.
Right. So I have a question here about the priorities that national governments set and the priorities that cities set or want to set, and the tension between those. So you talked a little bit about this, Bruce, earlier, about federal government defining the problem, committing to a solution, which often takes the form of legislation or spending, and then leaving it to cities to kind of do the integrative work and the adaptation. What if there's really competing interests and visions and perspectives on what the problem is to be solved, and how do you solve that in an intergovernmental dynamic?
Well, I think in many countries, cities spend too much time looking up to the national government or to provincial governments, and they spend less amount of time saying to themselves, what kind of power do we have, and what kind of capital do we have? Because city power is not just around fiscal and taxes. It's around markets and basically leveraging markets. It's around financial power, understanding public-private, civic capital stacks. It's around governance and the kind of institutions that Jeff's talking about. And it's around networks. And it's around getting more out of disparate constituencies together. So, look, we've run the cycle in the U.S. in particular. I mean, it's a roller coaster ride in terms of what the federal government decides are our priorities, what revenues do they put behind them, and how they structure that resource allocation. And generally speaking, the only constant is city and metropolitan leaders who have their head on straight, and basically can say, here's who we are, here's our strengths, here's what that we can leverage, here are challenges that are particular character and color to them, and here's the power and capital we have. So whether we're in federal largesse or federal scarcity or however else you want to, describe the higher, the apex of the federalist pyramid, so to speak, we're staying on course, and that gives us the ability to essentially respond to whatever's going on. The only thing that's constant is how inconstant national governments are. I mean, they're not close to the problems. What they are close is to whatever the ideological favor of the day is into partisan combat. Localities are more focused on the practical problem solving because you wake up every day and that's what you have before you. You can't duck it. You can't sort of invade Venezuela or whatever we're doing at the time. You have to basically address the challenges before you.
Thank you. Mary Rowe.
I had to get Venezuela.
Mary Rowe is asking, how much is this really about how money flows? And I want to ask you, Beth. She asks, if the federal or provincial state governments control resources, how can local governments be actually able to capitalize, do what needs to be done? So assuming that they take the time and effort to diagnose a problem in whatever way possible, how will they be able to act on that, if the power dynamic is imbalanced?
So we won't have time to cover this question satisfactorily. So let me just point to two things very quickly. One is obviously Bruce is talking about some of these networked approaches that leverage private capital, public-private partnership. There are creative ways to bring to bear new ways of solving problems, and that includes new sources of money and funding to be able to solve different kinds of problems. But since I'm usually play the tech role, let me say that I think that AI in many cases is bringing down the costs for things that used to be more expensive to do earlier. So again, depends on the specifics and the problem that we're trying to solve, but one thing that's on my mind is, again, another benefits delivery issue where the solution to the problem, if you will, obviously there was a big budget shortfall. Obviously there was funding cuts from the federal level that created fewer resources to deliver this benefit. But we were able to make people aware of the benefit by using new technology to get out the word with a mailing list to millions of people, whereas before we didn't have a way to communicate with residents, or we used AI to be able to improve how we delivered that service. We did the very simple task of making something that was only on the web available via mobile phone. So I could go on and on with kind of these small hacks that often are very cheap or free and can have very, very high leverage in terms of their impact for people, or even just a project that happened very recently that involved using AI to comb through databases to find people who essentially were falling off the rolls for a service and deliver them a service to which they were entitled, for which there was already funding and money, but they were missing the opportunity to get it because we sort of lost them. They fell between the cracks. So it was a very simple, cheap, just different way of working that by changing how we did things and applying some new tools to the process, we were able to be more effective without any new budgets.
Right. Yes, please.
Can I say something about money? Because in governments are obsessed with money for good reason, and often the discussions between the tiers are all about money flowing down, tax bases and so on. Obviously that matters a lot. But I think we're in an era where there's we need a shift in the balance between finance and other things. And it's very striking in the private sector. If you look at the 10 most valuable companies in the world, none of them are banks. None of them are finance institutions. Most of them are based on intelligence in its widest sense. And my guess is if we were inventing government at any level from scratch in the late 2020s, we'd put intelligence at its core. The orchestration of data, the sort of tools Beth's talked about, knowledge, tacit knowledge, all those things you need to get stuff to happen. And often you can solve problems by cleverly using intelligence without much money. And yet all of our public systems, as I say, city, national, and even at a global level where we have a World Bank and IMF, but nothing around intelligence. They're all locked in really a 20th century mindset, which I think often inhibits them from solving problems. And I would urge almost any city to think about how is it making the most of the intelligence in the city, in its universities, in its people, in its NGOs, in its businesses, and how do you harness those to solve problems? And that's a much more constructive way of thinking than just obsessively waiting for some more cash to come down from Washington or London or Paris.
So we talked about the constraints. We talked about the possibility of these new forms of collaboration, horizontal governance, institutional innovation. I have a question here from Franca van der Laan about pushback. So when you design or create and implement, build new institutions, there's still old institutions around. And so the tension that these new forms of governance create vis-a-vis the silos or other organizations and institutions can be prohibitive or inhibitive to making this happen. So can you speak to that? And maybe let's start with Beth, because you've done this, you all have done this, but you've most recently created a new innovation authority in New Jersey. So how does that relate to the current existing organization, and how do you avoid this new idea to be rejected by the body?
So I think you've done a lot of work over the years in thinking about how public labs get created, whether they exist, inside, outside, whether you create this innovation, where this innovation capacity kind of sits. And we've seen examples of these kinds of innovation units that have been stood up and then failed because they were rejected by the host culture, if you will. And whether it's failure or just having run their course, I think is an interesting question. And it was for us, I would say, difficult in the beginning to come in from outside, if you will, to stand up this new thing, to create this cross-cutting innovation capacity that was going to work in different ways from the way the current culture, that 20th century culture, or really 19th century culture, sort of worked. And what changed things was a crisis. What changed things was COVID. The fact that suddenly there was a need to go, we need a website that delivers information about reliable, services and health information during the pandemic, or we need to deliver testing and we need to deliver vaccinations and other things. And suddenly there was a realization that we needed some kind of a delivery and execution unit. So the recognition of what the need was, the ability to see quick wins. But then I think what was really central to it and what drives a lot of how I spend my time now was the fact that we didn't sort of silo that different way of working and thinking within this innovation unit. We started training everybody else, because no matter how big the team grew, you cannot run a government in new ways with 10 people, even with 100 people or 500 people. What we did was started training everybody in ways of using data, in ways of using human-centered design and acting in a more agile way and doing implementation. And then we started giving away that training to other people, and that's now grown into what we call our Innovate US initiative, which is a peer-to-peer learning initiative where innovators in government train one another. And we share examples with one another. So today we were on the phone with 6 different jurisdictions talking about how they use AI to do what Jen Palka calls regulatory decluttering, how they're using AI to simplify their regulatory codes. Virginia talking to Boston, talking to San Francisco, talking to Ohio about how they're each doing that, learning from one another so they can copy the examples. So in short, I think I'm getting away from the question here. But in short, I think the answer is to succeed at this, you both have to demonstrate success, but then you have to make sure to bring everybody else along for the ride.
Right. Bruce?
Yeah, so in the public asset realm, how do cities use land and buildings that they own in Copenhagen, it was used around the core port, the area between the downtown and the airport, to basically finance, without any additional public subsidy, a 21st century transit system. In Hamburg, they use public assets around the old port to help accelerate an energy transition. In Atlanta and other cities, what they're doing now, yes, they are creating some new institutions. The Atlanta Urban Development Corporation is a new institution that is able to put public assets, land and buildings owned by disparate sets of the Atlanta government, in the service of housing production. in some respects, these other agencies don't particularly see as, oh, they're stealing our power. They're actually giving them the capabilities to take defunct or derelict land and put it towards a productive use. In other cities, they've done less about institution building. They've used municipal property advisors, school districts, fire departments, sanitation departments, police departments. If their buildings are basically part of a larger development, revenues can flow back to them. So there's actually benefits that accrue. So I think part of this gets down to leadership and how it's expressed essentially from the get-go. Is this about a collective problem-solving ethos that begins to permeate the culture, or is it really combat between different silo agencies and all the rest? It's successful when it's a collective.
Let me shift gears and talk about a question that Fernando Monge is asking. This event is happening at an academic institution where you're at Harvard University. You all are at academic institutions, University College London, Northeastern University, and London School of Economics, and previously Brookings Institution. Jeff, you recently wrote, is what Fernando is writing here, about the need for social sciences to become more radical, as well as more exploratory and more prescriptive. Can you provide a few specific ideas on how social scientists or academics for that matter, can be bolder in their research to provide more useful insights, ideas, and options for this type of next-level urban problem solving?
Okay,
that's all.
I've got a book coming out later this year which gives a long, boring answer to that question. But in essence, my argument is that many of the social scientists around the world have increasingly focused on analysis of the past and present, but not to help on the design of future options, whether it's new ways of doing care or democracy or welfare or all the things we've talked about. And that's why often practice is, as it were, ahead of the theory. These guys are very much practitioners and focus on the learning by doing, because that is often more dynamic than being distant from the front line where the new ideas emerge. My hope is we will see much more reorientation of the social sciences to make the best of tools from design, creativity, exploration of all its kinds. And so that in a city is normal for all the universities to be very actively engaged in that much more iterative learning by doing process, whether it's changing your industrial structure, helping early years education, or dealing with mental health problems. Universities need, I think, be leading a little bit on that. They're in their comfort zone, as many people in Europe say, is doing brilliant critiques the way everything's going wrong, but not actually having many answers when people say, okay, so what would you do? Yeah. And that's why all of you are actually the exceptions. I think we just need to clone all of you massively, basically.
Well, we're trying our best to kind of invest in a global network of practitioners and scholars who are more interested in solving problems than in protecting their own turf or navel gazing. And the Bloomberg Center for Cities, is a university-wide center building bridges between disciplines and schools, as well as between academia and practice. And the most interesting work, is happening at that intersection, right, where there's a synergy and cross-pollination. Now, to make sure we end on a very actionable and practical note, I'd like to ask all of you to close with some thoughts about what city leaders today might do to invest in the problem-solving capacity for tomorrow. So we covered a whole range of ideas about what are the problems that need solving, what is wrong or insufficient about the current institutions, what do new forms of governance look like, and also what are the capabilities, the capacity, the skills needed. But if you are a city leader today, and many of them are here watching this live stream, what can you do concretely today to invest in the capacity to tackle tomorrow's problems? Let me start with you, Bruce, and then Beth, and then Jeff Moog.
Essentially, city leaders, and particularly elected officials, have a level of legitimacy. And right now, and again, this will be a US example, but I think this applies. We've got two sets of issues. On one hand, we're going through radical economic restructuring that is going to change the landscape of work and industry. And so that can be very general, very abstract, but when you get down to the city or metropolitan level, it is clear that a city led in collaboration with business and universities and others, how do we strengthen what is our particular position? And I think many parts of the country, whether it's Pittsburgh and AI and robotics, whether it's, Hampton Roads around the production of nuclear subs. I mean, it's pretty damn easy to figure out where do you have a distinctive position? Is it under threat? Is it, basically have some winds behind it? How do we leverage that? That is, so that's a strike team. That's a fast action. Where do we leverage public, private, and civic capital? The affordability crisis is a different kind of issue. We think housing has its moment now, right? We have a National Housing Crisis Task Force, Governor Cox from Utah, Andre Dickens from Atlanta, Justin Bibb from Cleveland, Fifth Third Bank. The ideas are out there, right? So how do you organize around that? Not to just overly deliberate, but move. So I would say both on economic restructuring, what's the purpose of, where are you relevant, essentially? And then how do you tackle affordability issues when it is clear it is not going to happen from the nation on down? It's your job. So those both are organizing challenges to some extent, with lots of examples both within the U.S. and outside the U.S. to apply, adapt, and move quickly.
So pick a really pressing problem and show it in the work itself.
Absolutely.
Beth?
So I would say Jeff tells half the story in terms of new organizational forms and new ways of working, these new mesh approaches to how we think about innovation. But that inquiry about new organizational forms should be complemented by changing the mindsets and skill sets of the people who work in those institutions. And Jeff also talks about that human dimension, but I'll just emphasize that in closing, which is very concretely, you can invest in training your workers, training people and teaching people to work differently in a more agile way, in a more data-driven way, in a more human-centered way, and now above all with AI, but learning what it means to use AI. So not talking about AI only in terms of risks, very real, but above all talking about how do we use these new tools responsibly, ethically, in a public interested way to work differently in service of the public interest. So I think the AI opportunity creates the wedge for all of us to ask what are those skills that we need and to start to think about training ourselves and our teams very, very concretely.
All right. Thank you. Jeff?
So one comment and one request actually to everyone on this call. The comment is, if you are a mayor, sometimes you'll best solve a problem with a program or a policy or a law, but sometimes an institution may be the best way of solving it and leaving a legacy. Don't be frightened of that. We've been in an era where many governments around the world have been worried, frightened of creating new public institutions with a strong public purpose. And then the request really is to the collective intelligence of this group. This is in a way a slightly emergent field. I certainly don't have all the answers. We would love to hear from you what you think are the really pressing problems which might most need institutional innovation. What are the great cases we should be aware of, which could be inspiring or instructive? And then what are the possibilities which don't yet exist, but in 5 or 10 years' time may be obvious and common sense? If anyone's got examples to share, please do so, because none of us can solve this stuff on our own. This has to be a shared process with you guys, partly the call.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank all of you for being here today, for sharing your perspectives. It's a really interesting experience for me because all of your books have been on my nightstand, and this is like my nightstand come alive in one room. So I've really enjoyed hearing you talk about your own ideas, but also this new theme that Jeff has introduced today about institutional innovation and the city as a mesh. The paper that Kayo Wernick and Jeff Mulgan published today. You should find a link in the chat box. I think you're looking for feedback on it.
Tell us what's
this
missing.
is a working paper. What's
wrong?
missing?
Yeah.
Please suggest examples that you are aware of, or offer feedback on the ideas articulated today. We will continue this thread of conversation and research for sure at the Bloomberg Center for Cities, and looking forward to seeing you next time at one of our events. Please like and subscribe. I don't know if there's buttons somewhere that I should point at, but definitely sign up for the newsletter so you can be aware of more conversations like this one. Thank you all very much for tuning in today, and have a wonderful 2026. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.